Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with Trump already having claimed victory in the war underway against Iran, as well as already announcing that Cuba will be the next to fall in his crusade to assert the Don Road Doctrine. Joining us is William LeoGrande, a professor of government and former dean of the American University School of Public Affairs. He is a specialist on Latin American politics and has been a frequent advisor to Congress on issues of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, including as a staffer to the Democratic Policy Committee of the United States Senate. He has written 5 books, including most recently Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, and has an article at The Conversation we will discuss, Cuba's speedboat shootout recalls long history of exile groups engaged in covert ops aimed at regime change. Then, with the Democrats holding up funding for DHS, we will look into what can be done to rein in, if not abolish, this dysfunctional hodgepodge of agencies run into the ground by Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski. Joining us is Mike Lofgren, who formerly spent 28 years working in Congress as a Republican aide, 16 of which as a senior analyst on the House and Senate budget committees. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Party Is Over, How Republicans Went Crazy, Democrats Became Useless, and the Middle Class Got Shafted. We will discuss his article at Salon, Abolish ICE, Absolutely, and DHS too. Then finally, Sacha Linden Cohen speaks with Karen Howe, an award-winning investigative journalist, author, and former engineer recognized for her coverage of AI's sweeping impact on every aspect of society. Formerly the senior AI editor at MIT Technology Review and a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, she authored the 2025 New York Times bestseller, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's Open AI. She was also named to the Time 100 Most Influential People in AI as she began reporting on AI, and specifically OpenAI, years before ChatGPT became a global sensation. And before we begin with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part delivering a daily public service providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And joining us now is William LeoGrande, who's a professor of government and the former dean of the American University School of Public Affairs. He's a specialist on Latin American politics and has been a frequent advisor to Congress on issues of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, including as a staffer to the Democratic Policy Committee of the United States Senate. He has written 5 books, including most recently, he's the co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. And he has an article at The Conversation, Cuba's speedboat shootout recalls long history of exile groups engaged in covert ops aimed at regime change. Welcome to Background Briefing, William LeoGrande.
It's good to be with you again.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it seems as though what's happening in Cuba is pretty dire. And I must say that the kind of crowing and glee that's being expressed by Trump and Rubio and Senator Graham about the collapse and fall of Cuba, they're all sort of, rubbing their hands in glee. But seems to be a total disregard for the humanitarian suffering that's happening on that island. How do you see it?
Well, I think that's right. It certainly is the case that they seem giddy with success. They may be counting their chickens before they hatch, actually. They have the capacity, the United States has the capacity to reduce the Cuban people to absolute misery by continuing to block any oil shipments to the island. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the government is going to collapse or that it's going to surrender to Donald Trump. There do appear to be some talks going on between the two sides. And the reporting suggests that they're focusing more on economic issues than on the issue of political change on the island. So it's possible, at least, that there might be enough common ground for some kind of an agreement. But it does seem like President Trump, in particular, really is sort of already, planning Marco Rubio's inauguration as the next president of Cuba.
Well, obviously the situation is dire. If from what the New York Times was recently reporting, there are abandoned cars and motorcycles all over the place. I mean, they are literally running out of fuel, and the airlines that normally fly in there, particularly the Canadian airlines, because Canadians are extremely popular in Cuba. The Cuban people have a lot of affection for the Canadians. Their Air Canada stopped flying in there simply because they can't get refueled. So what are you hearing from the island? Because we have a source down there who reports for Reuters, and we've been back and forth with him trying to get an interview, but we we can't interview him. Guess why, Bill? Because the electricity's cut off and the batteries on his computer run down. So that's just anecdotally what we're learning of how bad it is.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's very bad now, and it's going to get worse as the fuel reserves that Cuba has gradually run out. Unless new oil shipments come into the island, you can, within a month or so, bring much of the Cuban economy to a dead stop. And, at that point, becomes a sort of subsistence economy. The humanitarian cost of that, of course, is enormous. When there's no electricity, hospitals don't have power. Operating rooms don't have power. Infant incubators don't have power. There's no power for the garbage trucks to go around. There's no fuel for the garbage trucks to go around picking up the garbage. There's no gasoline for an ambulance or for the trucks that distribute food to people in the cities. A lot of the urban residences in Cuba, the upper floors, get their water as a result of electrically powered pumps. So when there's no electricity, there's no water. So the situation is indeed very dire and getting worse on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's not just that the Trump administration isn't cognizant of this. I think they're very cognizant of it. I think that's the design of the policy, to reduce Cuban society to absolute abject poverty in the hopes that this will force the Cuban government to surrender.
So what is the situation then with these negotiations that are supposedly going on in Mexico City with Raul Castro's son, and also I believe his grandson is also negotiating? They're both with Rubio and I'm not sure who else, but there seems to be at least two tracks going on. What do you know about that, Bill?
Well, I was skeptical at first, actually, that there were negotiations underway because the Cuban government was denying it. But that's not unusual. Negotiations that begin as secret contacts, both sides usually pledge to keep them secret. President Trump, of course, opened the door by talking about them in public. I think for a while there, the Cubans were basically keeping their agreement not to talk publicly about these talks. But there's been enough reporting now, not just from the U.S. government, but from diplomats in other countries, in particular CARICOM countries, because supposedly there was one of these meetings between Raul Castro's grandson and some of Marco Rubio's advisors. So I do think there's some kind of a dialogue going on. We just don't know how close the two sides are in terms of what they might agree to. If the Trump administration is insisting upon Cubans making major changes to their political system, I don't think that the Cubans are going to agree to that. On the other hand, if the Trump administration is more interested in a kind of transactional economic agreement that would open up the Cuban market to U.S. investors, there might be enough common ground to get an agreement. The principal obstacle to U.S. commercial engagement with Cuba is not the Cuban government. Historically, it has been the U.S. embargo. So we'll just have to wait and see. There's no way to know. I would point out, however, that if the Trump administration is sticking to its maximalist demands and the Cubans don't agree to it, the possibility of some kind of military strike on Cuba is very real. After all, the attacks on Venezuela and Iran were preceded by negotiations that the Trump administration says failed.
So, what's going on then with GAESA, which is the big military-run conglomerate, which controls much of the economy? And I'm sure that the military, of course, will be holding back fuel reserves, but GAESA has made massive investments in building hotels in the last 15 years. They've invested about $24 billion in hotels. Some of the best hotels on the island are controlled by the military. So given that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is all about building hotels on beachfront property in Gaza, I could see a certain attraction there that the Trump family could make a deal with GAESA to get in on the hotel boom, because obviously the beaches there are incredibly pristine, as are the reefs and the fisheries and all this stuff. I'm sure they're salivating over the possibility of getting in on the act in terms of tourism with some kind of post-communist government.
Well, there is some precedent for this. Before Trump was elected the first time in 2016, he twice sent some of his advisors down to Cuba to investigate the possibility of investments in hotels and golf courses. So, this is obviously an area of business that President Trump has a lot of interest in. And as you say, Cuba is an ideal travel location with one of the best preserved cities from the colonial period of anywhere in Latin America, with fantastic beaches and with a very well built out tourism infrastructure. What it is lacking, though, right now is external capital in order to basically keep the tourist industry running. And U.S. sanctions are also keeping people away. So if there's an economic deal to be made, I would imagine the tourist sector would be at the center of it.
So what is the story, though, with GAESA, the idea that the military-run conglomerate dominates the economy? I mean, it's a bit like in Iran, where the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, owns so much of the businesses. And Mushtaba, the new supreme leader, he owned a big bank in Iran. I find it a little strange that a communist government would have this kind of... I mean, who's running the show, and who would be able to dispose of these assets and make the kind of deals with the Trump family that we're talking about?
Well, there's a history to it. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to pull back its assistance to Cuba, the Cubans decided that they needed their own military industry to produce things like uniforms, small arms, ammunition, and that sort of thing. And so Raul Castro sent some promising young officers off to Western Europe to business school. And when they came back, they became the sort of core cadre of building up very efficiently these military industries. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. All the Soviet advisors in Cuba, both military and non-military, went home, and Cuba decided to turn to tourism as the new centerpiece and engine of growth of the economy. So the military, which already had some experience in industry, and also had control now over all of these vacant residences that had been the places where the advisors lived, turned them into the early hotels in Cuba. So right away, the military got into the hotel business. And the hotel business was a huge boom for Cuba. In the space of just a couple of decades, they went from having about 100,000 tourists a year to having more than 4 million tourists per year. And it really did become the center of the Cuban economy, and the military's economic influence grew along with it. The military then expanded into other areas like import-export and retail sales in dollar stores. So it was this historical trajectory, plus the fact that the military economic enterprises were frankly more efficient than civilian state enterprises. And so the military just kept basically getting a larger and larger slice of the pie. I don't think it's right to say that they dominate the economy, but they do, or at least did, dominate the sectors of the economy that were earning foreign exchange currency. And for a small island, that's extremely important.
Well, the other revenue stream the U.S. cut off, right? The remittances from Cubans in Florida, for example.
So in his first administration, Trump cut off the ability of Cuban Americans to wire money to their families. But Cubans are very entrepreneurial, and they found informal ways to get remittances down there. Either people just carrying the remittances, and during the pandemic, when there was no travel and you couldn't just carry money down, they found other ways to do it. Very clever ways to get money to their family and friends. And a lot of that informal money that went down or went down in informal ways didn't go through the Cuban government. It just went direct from family to family. Now, in 2021, the Cuban government legalized private businesses to engage in retail sales. And so all over Cuba, small retail outlets sprung up selling imported goods. Well, now families who were getting remittances could go and afford to buy things in these private retail outlets because there's, those outlets, they're selling at world market prices. So the average Cuban can't really afford to shop in them. But if you're getting remittances, you can. So not only did the government miss out on collecting a fee for the wire service remittances, now they are also missing out on Cubans using their dollars in state-run dollar stores. Instead, Cubans are spending their dollars in private enterprises, which is, going into the pocket of the owner, being used to expand or to restock their supplies, or some of it being sent out of the country. And so the government has really lost control of the flow of remittances and consequently doesn't have that hard currency to import things.
So just in closing then, William LeoGrande, the Cuban government did crack down on demonstrators a couple of years back, and they were quite brutal about it. And given how terrible the conditions are, and the people must be incredibly angry and frustrated, and they got no gasoline, they're abandoning cars on the side of the road, all the stuff that you've talked about, including not being able to get water up to, second, third, fourth story buildings, one would expect that there could be some civil discontent or some kind of demonstrations. What do you think the scenario is there? Because I would think that if things got really bad in terms of people rising up and street battles, etc., not that the people are armed, but the government repressing them, then Trump might find an excuse to send the military in.
Well, he might very well. I think it is reasonable to expect that there will be more of that sort of spontaneous civil unrest as a result of the economic situation deteriorating further. In 2021, there was this big nationwide set of demonstrations, not really coordinated with one another, but sort of in a kind of domino fashion where people saw on their cell phones a streaming account of demonstrations in other places and went out into the streets themselves. And since that time, there hasn't been anything nationwide, partly because the government learned the lesson of that and cuts off the internet when there's any kind of big demonstration. But there's been a lot of small neighborhood demonstrations where people in a particular neighborhood, their power is out for 3 days. They don't have any water. It's the middle of the summer. And, their apartments are stiflingly hot. And they go out in the street and they demonstrate. The government's been able to contain those kind of demonstrations. And any time a particular person emerges as an organizer of such things or a promoter of such things, they get a visit from the police and they're told either to stop that or they'll end up in jail or maybe they should leave the country. And so the result of that is that a lot of what would ordinarily be organizers for an organized opposition are living now in Miami or Madrid. And so there's general agreement, even in the United States government, that there isn't any organized opposition in Cuba today, despite the fact that there is broad discontent generally with the situation that the country is in, and even with the government for what people see as the mismanagement of that crisis.
Well, William LeoGrande, I hope to stay in touch because clearly this is in humanitarian terms, it's quite dire. Meanwhile, you've got Trump, Hegseth, Rubio, Senator Graham all strutting their stuff. I feel very sorry for the Cuban people. They don't deserve this.
No, they don't. It's a very tough time for them.
And again, I've been speaking with William LeoGrande, a professor of government and a former dean of the American University School of Public Affairs. He's a specialist on Latin American politics and has been a frequent advisor to Congress on issues of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, including as a staffer to the Democratic Policy Committee of the United States Senate. He has written 5 books, including most recently, he co-authored Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. And he has an article at The Conversation, Cuba's Speedboat Shootout Recalls Long History of Exile Groups Engaged in Covert Ops Aimed at Regime Change. We're going to take a brief station break, and with the Democrats holding up funding for DHS, we'll look into what can be done to rein in, if not abolish, this dysfunctional hodgepodge of agencies run into the ground by Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski.
De Alto Cedro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Mike Lofgren, who formerly spent 28 years working in Congress as a Republican aide, 16 of which as a senior analyst on the House and Senate Budget Committees. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Party Is Over, How Republicans Went Crazy, Democrats Became Useless, and the Middle Class Got Shafted. And he has an article at Salon, Abolish ICE, Absolutely, and DHS too. Welcome to Background Briefing, Mike Lofgren.
Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And of course, at this point, DHS is not being funded, although ICE has plenty of money out of their $75 billion, which, as you point out in your Salon article, is more than the entire British defense budget. So what do you think is happening now with the Democrats? Are they going to stay firm and get something out of, in terms of reforms? Trump obviously is pretty pig-headed and of course boneheaded as well. And now you have the situation with asymmetrical warfare where the Iranians are probably going to target the United States, since we and the Israelis killed their supreme leader, and everybody else we can drop a bomb on. So do you think the Democrats are going to stay firm until they get something out of this standoff?
Well, I'm no Nostradamus, so I can't predict that. All I can say is I hope so, that they get something out of this. Now, what I'm talking about, abolishing the agency, that isn't going to happen until they have a president and majorities in both chambers. But let's hope they get something out of this.
And you point out that the original sin, if you will, came after the attacks of September the 11th, where the George Bush administration essentially scapegoated federal intelligence and law enforcement agencies over the disaster, but not himself as the captain of the ship, or Condoleezza Rice. We all remember, of course, the CIA briefing bin Laden determined to strike in the United States, which they ignored. Meanwhile, of course, Attorney General Ashcroft, his top priority was the menace of internet porn, and Ashcroft rejected a $50 million FBI request to hire additional counterterrorism agents and intelligence specialists on September the 10th, the day before the attacks. So walk us through what I guess we could call original sin.
Well, the original sin, as you kind of recounted there, came from the fact that Bush and his cabinet members did not take seriously the warnings of terrorism that were being presented to them. And then they needed an alibi, and an alibi needs a scapegoat. And the scapegoat was, well, it didn't come up from the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is stovepiped, it's acts too slow, and et cetera, et cetera. And there were a Republican majority in the House, and it was tied in the Senate. It wasn't likely that the blame was going to be placed on Bush, so they had to do something. And the bright idea bubbled out of Congress to create the Department of Homeland Security. Note, the big proponent of this was Joe Lieberman, who was basically not very well liked and remembered by the Democratic Party because he was basically just a Republican in disguise. Nevertheless, this went forward, and it became kind of this bureaucratic monster that was sort of assembling the cast-off agencies of all the other departments. And it was truly less than the sum of its parts. I didn't think it was a particularly good idea at that time. And it's in the last 20 plus years, it's definitely proven out as a bureaucratic failure. It immediately became a dumping ground for like sons-in-law of rich contributors to the Republican National Committee and that kind of stuff. And already in 2005, we had the director of FEMA, which was within DHS, Michael Brown, who became kind of a punchline himself when they were totally unprepared for Hurricane Katrina, and Bush came down to New Orleans and said, "Heck of a job, Brownie."
Well, Kristi Noem is no longer with us, and nor is Corey Lewandowski, and I guess their incompetence was overshadowed by their romance, wasn't it? I mean, they bought a $70 million Boeing 737 MAX 8, which they were supposed to fly immigrants out of the country who were being deported, flying prison, but in fact they only had 18 seats, and they installed showers, a kitchen, a bar, and a bedroom with a queen-size bed, as well as 4 large flat-screen TVs. And then on top of that, of course, apparently Lewandowski and Kristi Noem commandeered a Coast Guard beachfront property for their trysts, and then she put in charge of overseeing ICE's $1 billion budgets a 28-year-old who spent 1.5 million on 25 new sports utility vehicles. And now, of course, there are 2,500 vehicles custom wrapped sitting in storage that because they have ICE logos on them. And of course, ICE with their masks and stuff like to operate anonymously. So it kind of defeats the purpose of their anonymity. ICE, of course, has got 75 billion separate from DHS's budget. So how do you get rid of ICE when the standoff now is between the Democrats and DHS, but nobody seems to be touching ICE?
Well, their budget is within yes, so that does affect them. The problem is they got so much, it affects them in a theoretical way. The problem is that ICE got so much in the last appropriation that they're probably not in any difficulty, which again is another reason why when Democrats get the leverage, that means the majority, they've got to abolish it. They have to unmake this monster that was made. And if they cannot convince the public that this is a good idea, then we might as well give up our democracy. Because if you can't convince American citizens that kindergartners aren't fair game for being abducted, you might as well give up.
Well, Trump and the Republicans seem to think that pushing through the SAVE Act will save the Republican Party from what will be a wipeout in November. And I guess the SAVE Act depends upon the stupidity of the American voter, right? Because on the surface, it sounds, like a good idea. People who vote should be verified and should have some kind of an ID. The voting fraud is a non-existent problem, but Trump has made it into a huge problem. So are the Democrats doing an adequate job pointing out this big lie that this has nothing to do with voter ID, first of all, and also they're going to get rid of mail-in ballots, which is a convenience that both Democrats and Republican voters use. But on top of that, they're going to be disenfranchising millions of Democratic voters, and that's what it's all about. It's all about disenfranchising Democratic voters, not about securing our elections.
Well, one, this is blatantly obvious. There were some Democrats who voted for this. And, did they read the bill before they voted? It's just astonishing to me. And the second point in answering one of your questions is I don't think the Democrats are doing a very good job of alerting the American people about what they have to do, because I haven't searched specifically for this issue, but it doesn't really come up in most people's news feed because they haven't made news out of it.
So shouldn't that be the priority then? If the only way we get any reform in this country is to get rid of Trump and the Republicans, the only chance
that goes without saying.
Of
Absolutely.
course. So that ought to be the top priority. And the only way that this is not going to happen is if somehow or other the SAVE Act is pushed through and the Senate decides to get rid of the filibuster, which is a pretty radical move. But they're pretty desperate. It's not just Trump who doesn't want the Democrats to take the House and Senate. It's also the Republicans themselves, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
So just in closing, where do we stand?
It also depends on how the Iran war goes. It has not been going according to the plans of the great leader and his paladins. And we'll have to see about that. Regardless of who the voters are, they're not going to like $4 a gallon gas. Uh,
Well, it's
you
already
know, a lot
$5.
of people,
It's already $5 here in California.
well, it was about in the low twos in a lot of the big square states in the middle of the country, and they're about to get a rude surprise. But that will get their attention more than bombing foreigners will. So I think uh, Iran may be one of the keys as to what happens in November, how long this plays out. And it does not just involve oil, it involves fertilizer. 20% of the oil in the world comes out of the Persian Gulf and through the Straits of Hormuz. But because uh, energy is so cheap to make fertilizer, they make 30% of the world's fertilizer. And it is just before spring planting season now in the Northern Hemisphere. So that affects food prices everywhere.
Well, just in closing, Mike, then the priority then is to defeat the Republicans, to stop the Stave Act, and then get rid of DHS and ICE in that order.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, any last invocation to the American electorate? Not that we're speaking to that many Americans.
Yes, start paying attention to the news.
Well, Mark Lofgren, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Mike Lofgren, who formerly spent 28 years working in Congress as a Republican aide, 16 of which were as a senior analyst on the House and Senate budget committees. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Party is Over, How Republicans Went Crazy, Democrats Became Useless, and the Middle Class Got Shafted. And he has an article at Salon, Abolish ICE, Absolutely, and DHS too. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with Sasha Linden Cohen speaking with Karen Howe about AI's sweeping impact on every aspect of society.
Well, I'm going to tell you, fascists, you may be surprised. People in this world are getting organized. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. All you fascists bound to lose. I said, all you fascists bound to lose. Yes, sir.
Welcome back. I'm Sasha Linden Cohen, and you're listening to Background Briefing. So artificial intelligence is often talked about as the next big technological revolution. It's going to transform everything from how we work to how governments operate, and we can already see that happening. But journalist Karen Howe says the story behind that transformation is much messier and more global than people realize. It extends far beyond Silicon Valley. So she has a new book out. It's called Empire of AI: Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI, and Howe takes readers inside the rise of OpenAI and its CEO, Sam Altman. She draws on years of reporting and hundreds of interviews tracing how a nonprofit with big ideals about safety and developing AI with responsibility became the center of an intense global race for AI, and it's reshaping economies, politics, and the environment. So thank you so much for joining the show, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you first started covering OpenAI back in 2019, and at that point, you really thought they were the good guys, so to speak. What about the company's early mission made it seem different than the rest of Silicon Valley as someone who'd been covering tech?
Yeah, well, OpenAI really framed itself as different from Silicon Valley because it was not a for-profit company. It was designed to be a nonprofit, and they were going to share all of the research that they did completely openly with the public for free. And of course, that's not typically how companies run. And so I went to the offices and embedded with them for 3 days in 2019, sincerely curious about how they'd sort of pulled this off, how they'd been able to recruit such great talent and been able to craft this mission that would, as they said, shape the future of AI development. And what I discovered was they were actually very different from what they advertised.
That became clear when you first went there. you would say, or just as it turned out? Obviously they stopped being a nonprofit. Things changed a lot in the sort of AI landscape, but sort of when did it become clear to you that was not exactly the case?
It started becoming clear the first day that I went to the company. And the reason is because on the first day, I met Greg Brockman, at the time, the chief technology officer of OpenAI. Now, he is the president, and Ilya Sutskever, who was the chief scientist, who has since left the company. But I was just asking them really basic questions like, how do you define artificial general intelligence? Because that was a key part of their mission, is they wanted to build this so-called AGI. And why do you specifically want to spend so much money on that? Like they had already raised over $1 billion at that point and were funneling it into this mission. And they just couldn't even articulate the answers to those two fundamental questions. And so that already tipped me off that something was not quite right, because this is actually a very classic Silicon Valley characteristic of startups, is that you are flooded with money early on without actually a clear articulation of what you're doing, simply because you have a lot of connections to people with the pocket strings. And then I noticed in the second and third days that the organization was incredibly secretive. For one, that said that they were a nonprofit that was going to share all of their research with the public. They were controlling all of my movements. They were very careful about ushering me out whenever there was a meeting.
Hmm.
They wouldn't let me go into, like, I was only allowed to stay on the first floor, not go to the second floor where people were actually working. And every time I had interviews with other people, they would kind of like steal furtive glances to the communications person, like every other sentence. And I was like, this just doesn't feel like what they're saying it is, which
Hmm.
is supposed to be a totally open and public endeavor. And then through later reporting for the same piece, when I started doing more interviews, people were like, "Oh yeah, this organization is like the most secretive place I've ever worked for." And also, there's a lot of projects that they're doing that they are hiding from the public.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it feels like it quickly devolved into something else, and that promise was changed fairly rapidly, even in the public vision. Um, I'm curious about the framing device as like a modern day empire, AI as an industry. I'd love for you to tell me about two things. Sort of, A, what do you mean by this idea of a modern empire? Who is bearing the cost of this technological expansion? And also why you think OpenAI is at the fore of that, why you decided to focus on them as a company sort of leading this brigade.
So I think kind of to understand this, first I should say that AI is a collection of many different types of technologies, and I sometimes make the analogy that AI is like the word transportation. Transportation can refer to anything from a bicycle to a rocket. And my critique of the Silicon Valley idea of AI is really focused on their pursuit of these large scale, quote unquote, general purpose models like ChatGPT. And so to answer the second part of your question first, the reason I focused on OpenAI is because they were the ones that introduced the idea of racing on this particular kind of AI. And before they entered the scene, there was actually a much broader diversity of ideas around what AI technology is and what it can do and what it should do for people. And they kind of collapsed that diversity by really focusing on large language models and just continuing to aggressively scale them with ever more data and ever larger supercomputers. And the rest of the industry then followed. And so the parallels that I draw in my book between what I call the empires of AI and the empires of old is really four parallels. One is that these companies, in their pursuit of this colossal scale, lay claim to resources that are not their own, including the data of individuals and the intellectual property of writers and creators. They exploit an extraordinary amount of labor. That is another reason why they're able to accumulate such rapid value to themselves, because they're actually not paying the workers that critically contribute to that value their fair share. And that's like thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands at this point of data annotators that are all around the world, increasingly, in fact, in the US, but began in the global south in countries like Kenya and Venezuela that were doing the detailed work of labeling every single piece of data that ends up getting fed into these models to train them. The third parallel is that they monopolize knowledge production. So these companies, because the technologies they're building is so costly, they can kind of project this sense that anyone else who is not within the company does not know what they're talking about. We are the only experts that have visibility into this technology, and therefore you must listen to what we have to say about the limitations and capabilities. But what's actually happening is they're distorting public understanding of these technologies by censoring anything that's inconvenient for the public to know and only publishing and sometimes salaciously framing the research results that actually fuel the continued justification of their accumulation of resources. And fourth and finally, empires always have this existential and moral imperative narrative around their existence. So these companies portray themselves as the good empire on a civilizing mission to bring progress and modernity to all of humanity. And that's why they need to accumulate all the data and exploit all the labor, is because ultimately they are going to apparently bring us to a kind of utopia or a heaven-like state. And if they lose to an evil empire, instead humanity is going to descend into hell.
I want to return to this idea of AI as an empire knowledge holder, sort of the sole holder of this knowledge. But first, can you tell me about the supply chain? I mean, I think it's a pretty rare thing that you did going sort of all the way back. You reported from places way outside of Silicon Valley, Kenya, where workers are paid to filter harmful content, as you mentioned, Chile, where data centers are consuming huge amounts of water. Tell me about that supply chain, and I think why it was important to understand it to really build the full picture of these companies.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes for other industries like fashion or food, we're quite familiar with the idea that there is a supply chain behind it and it is global and sprawling, and there might be harmful practices happening along that supply chain that we need to examine and shore up in order to make that particular industry more sustainable and ethical. But when it comes to digital technologies, even though this is it's in fact exactly the same, there's also a global sprawling supply chain. The way that people interact with these tools, as just an app on their phone, and the way that companies advertise their tools as this magical thing that fell from the heavens, makes it appear as though there isn't that supply chain. And if you do not actually examine the full footprint of what goes into making these technologies, you would get a very uneven, inaccurate picture of the impact that it's having on the world. And so the two pieces that I looked at most in my book was the data that goes into the models and then the data centers that are used to train the models on that data. And just when it comes to the data, one of the things that people don't realize is that it requires an enormous amount of human labor to actually get the data to a point where it is effective at training the models to do what they do. Not only is it so, like, these companies will scrape the internet, and there's a lot of human labor that then goes into reviewing and analyzing that data, but also into content moderating the data, and also into literally, once the model is trained, chatting with the large language model to then teach it how to, in fact, answer to users in a compelling way. So there's like tens of thousands of workers that are literally asking it questions, and then when the model responds with an answer, they're upvoting or downvoting it based on whether it was helpful, whether it was interesting, and then they're drafting new answers to say this is what a better answer would be to guide the model towards being more effective at engaging users. And even though this work is literally essential. The workers that are doing it are paid like a pittance. I spoke with workers that OpenAI contracted in Kenya to do the content moderation work, and they were paid on average $2 an hour. And were being exposed to really grotesque content, part of that content moderation that then ultimately was crucial to turning ChatGPT into a viral success and OpenAI into a household name overnight. And to this day, some of the workers are still suffering from traumatic stress, symptoms after doing that work back in 2021. So it's already been almost 5 years of distance, and they still struggle with what they saw.
Turning to the other aspect of the empire, sort of beyond resource colonialism in the sense of using water and sort of this other aspect of forcing people to filter through this data at a very low cost and not providing them with any other resources. There's also the kind of more literal aspect of empire. There's been a lot of news recently about OpenAI's new relationship with the Pentagon. I know Anthropic had a relationship with the Pentagon, and because they wouldn't change their terms of agreement, that relationship sort of fractured, obviously, and Sam Altman is kind of coming in to take that place. I'm curious about this relationship and sort of what that can tell us about the future of AI, because not only is it an empire unto itself, but it's also being used as a tool for the literal American empire. And sort of if you dive into that at all in the book. I know this is slightly more recent news, but I'm curious if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I don't dive into this aspect in the book, but one of the things that happened after the book came out, because the book came out in May of last year, is like I froze the manuscript before Trump was reinaugurated. And so basically what happens past the page is that yeah, you're exactly right. Like the American empire is also trying to use the tools of the empires of AI to facilitate the country's own dominance and expansion. And what we saw with this news was that, first of all, like Anthropic kind of emerged out of this with a lot of people believing that it was like the better company, but there are some seriously complicating details in terms of Anthropic's involvement in this. Like they were fast to strike that early deal with the Pentagon and to offer the Pentagon their technologies, understanding that the purpose of the Pentagon is military operations. And the reason why the relationship devolved was not necessarily because of what it has, like widely been perceived, which is that Anthropic held the line on two things: no surveillance, mass surveillance of Americans, and no autonomous weapons. The New York Times reported that it was specifically over a clause that they couldn't agree on, which was that Anthropic was actually totally fine with working with the Pentagon to develop autonomous weapons, and they were totally fine with the Pentagon using Claude for surveillance as allowed under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act for classified material. They just didn't want the Pentagon to buy bulk data that was commercially available, unclassified on Americans, and then process that through Claude. So like the red lines that they portray publicly is like quite
Mm-hmm.
um, messier in reality. But there was a bit of a personality clash as well. Like the person at the Pentagon that was negotiating the deal is Emil Michael, who was formerly a top executive at Uber, so also a Silicon Valley guy. And the New York Times reported that Michael and Dario Amodei just simply did not get along. And in the middle of this fracturing, OpenAI then swoops in because OpenAI and Anthropic also have a very long and complicated history where Anthropic was actually founded as a splinter group from OpenAI. Amodei left
Mm-hmm.
OpenAI when he was a senior executive because he did not trust Altman. And so they've been like not just competitors commercially, but they're like personal rivals. And Altman then swooped in and saw this kind of opportunity of, okay, if Anthropic and the Pentagon are not going to get along, then like I'm going to position OpenAI as the alternative solution. And Emil Michael was also very happy to engage in that because he personally liked Altman more, according to the Times. And so like this entire mess really illustrates the degree to which there is so little accountability now in not just the technology creation process, but also in then who and how adopts this technology for what ends. And traditionally, when there are these really high stakes technology acquisitions by the US government, there is, a public request for technology companies to bid on the contract. There is a period in which the public can actually comment on the contracts. And all of that democratic process has completely eroded away. And it's both Silicon Valley and the Trump administration that have been equally keen to erode that away.
Just in closing, I wanted to ask about Dario Amodei, who is the CEO of Anthropic, which runs the chatbot Claude. As you mentioned, he has kind of positioned himself as like the morally righteous AI guy, as opposed to all of these other people who don't care, who don't want to put in any guardrails. And I wonder if that's a good faith presentation of who he is, and also whether that sort of moral responsibility that he's at least projecting extends to the sort of resource empire that you describe of water, data, gas, people who are being exploited in the global south. He's obviously kind of trying to be this good guy, and I wonder if that's at all a factor in his trying to be responsible in his development of AI.
Yeah, so the way that I would describe Anthropic is sort of like the concept of clean coal. It's like it doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
And the reason is because all the things that we have been talking about around the empire, the extraordinary scale, extraordinary resource consumption, the labor exploitation, Anthropic engages in all of the same things. And in fact, Dario Amodei, when he was an executive at OpenAI, was one of the drivers of OpenAI taking this path of aggressively scaling and setting off the industry-wide race. And Amodei even accelerated the race then by then splintering off of OpenAI to create a competitor. That was a huge acceleration in OpenAI's desire to then scale even faster, because now they have, another lab that is trying to scale just as fast. And Amodei has this ideology where he thinks that in order to achieve safety, you have to be faster than everyone else. So there is this like counterintuitive logic where he thinks you need to be the earliest in order to then shape the norms of the industry, as well as have a lead time to work on making your product safer. But the reality of how that has played out over the years is that it has just pushed the industry to go faster and faster and faster, and to build more and more and more data centers, completely undermining communities and the planet. And so his like attempt to whitewash this track record is exactly that. It is the clean coal of AI.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we've been speaking again with Karen Howe. She has a new book out. It's called Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI.
And thank you. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.